My name is Danilo Petranovic, and I work at the Abigail Adams Institute and one of the sponsors of today's lecture. The Institute is an independent scholarly enterprise interested in reviving classical liberal arts education at Harvard. We've been around for half a dozen years now, and our main mode of programming is the intensive seminar format, where we explore subject matter ranging from American political thought, metaphysics and faith, sociology, questions of man and woman, and other such things. We also seek to enable kindred intellectual projects, more on that soon, which are organized by faculty as well as students, and recently even by some of our young alumni interested in continuing their liberal arts education after Harvard. You can check out some examples on our website, aicambridge.org, and at the end of the lecture, I will also preview and highlight some of our programs at the end. Okay. Occasionally, the Institute puts on lectures, panels, and even debates. Today's event is part of our annual lecture series, which we started 5 years ago. We had, actually in this hall, we had the great Polish philosopher Ryszard Legutko speak. We'll have to have him again soon as well. The mission of the lecture series is, quote, to introduce arguments and speakers who can expand the philosophical horizons of our audience and have them reimagine the intellectual and cultural possibilities of the present. And our expectation is that today's speaker will certainly do that for us. So we're delighted to be here at Harvard Hall in the Harvard Yard. This venue was made possible by our wonderful co-sponsors, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and their leader, Professor Tyler Vanderbilt, sitting right there. And that's also his colleague, Brendan Case, the Associate Director. The Human Flourishing Program brings together scholars from a variety of academic disciplines in order to develop systematic approaches to study human flourishing, and their website is right there below ours, so please check them out. Now, I would like to introduce one of our student fellows, who will then introduce our speaker. And a quick note, we will record the main event, but then the Q&A will not be recorded. So ask hard, edgy questions if you want. Okay, Gabby Landry is a junior at Harvard College, Quincy House resident, and a philosophy concentrator. She's especially interested in theories of education, and then in character education in particular. Gabby came to the Institute through one of our popular summer seminars and has been affiliated with us ever since. Gabby.
As Danilo said, my name is Gabby, and I've had the privilege and joy of working with our speaker, Erika Bachiochi, for over 3 years now at AAI. So Erika is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. A graduate of Middlebury College, Erika was a Bradley Fellow at the Institute for Religion and Politics at Boston College, received her law degree from Boston University School of Law, and spent a year as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. She is the director of the Wollstonecraft Project at AAI. So when I first met Erika in spring 2018, my first thought was, this woman is brilliant. That summer before starting at Harvard, we would drive together into the AAI office. And I remember those car conversations fondly and honestly still in awe. Erika would draw connections across literally centuries of political thought in just sentences. And I remember sitting there thinking, I should be taking notes. And I still think that many times while in conversation with Erika and while reading through chapters of her book, The Rights of Women, which you'll hear more about tonight. Erika sheds new light on the unsung contributions of Mary Wollstonecraft. She brings Wollstonecraft in conversation with centuries of thinkers. And she also offers this conversation to us anew in 2021. Beyond the vast history, constitutional law, and political thought that Erika pulls together in the book, there's something more. There's hope. Hope for a renewed vision of feminism for the common good. Erika brings her whole heart to her work, and her call to reimagine feminism today echoes how she lives her life. I remember at the AAI Christmas party a couple years ago when she held her baby Charlotte, while telling me about the connections between Mary Wollstonecraft's vision of responsibilities and Marianne Glendon's views of dignitarian feminism. For Erika, the work-life balance isn't about separation or time management. It's about harmonizing. It's about showing up as our fullest selves, no matter where we are. Erika really lives out the thesis of her book, that by celebrating the work of the home and the contributions of families, we can get closer to freedom and flourishing. How might we harmonize our own rights and responsibilities? How might we live in a way that honors our own dignity and the dignity of others? Erika's work helps us think about these questions, philosophically, personally, and practically. Erika leads by example and is an inspiring mentor as well as a forward thinker. So please join me in welcoming Erika to present Vindicating Mary Wollstonecraft's Rights, the Priority of Duty, Virtue, and the Common Good.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Danilo. And thanks so many of you, many friends here, for joining me today. I have to say that this book would not exist without the work of Gabby Landry. She is tireless, amazing attention to detail, but also just keen intelligence, and has been such a pleasure to work with. So I keep being excited that she's going to stay with me long. So thank you, Gabby, for that lovely, lovely introduction. Probably the best I've ever had, I have to say. So thank you. I also just want to, before I get started, just recognize my parents who are here, and then Marianne Glendon, who's now retired at Harvard Law School, as well as Carol Crossed, who is our first benefactor of the Wollstonecraft Project, which is now offline there, but she has been a tremendous support for all of my work, and I'm just really pleased that we've gotten to start this work here at AAI. So those who have only a passing acquaintance with Mary Wollstonecraft's thought can be forgiven for wondering how she has anything to do with duty, virtue, or the common good. After all, wasn't she just a female version of the radical liberal Thomas Paine? That is a French revolutionary who simply extended to women late 18th century appeals for the rights of men. And in her duel with Edmund Burke over the same, wasn't it he and his critique of abstract rights in favor of English traditions that the Reign of Terror so clearly vindicated? To put more of a fine point on it, how could the short-lived wife of the anarchist William Godwin teach us anything about the common good? And it is true. For more than 200 years, Wollstonecraft has been both scorned and lionized for her rather complicated political and romantic associations. It's only very recently that she has been recognized as a canonical philosopher in her own right, and as it turns out, one whose early work was deeply influenced by pre-modern thought. And so I want to argue today that her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, can serve for this reason as a crucial corrective to modern natural rights theories that have tended to undermine thinking about and acting with a view toward the common good. And I want to argue that this is especially true when it comes to those goods that have been under particular assault since at least the sexual revolution. Marriage and the child-rearing family. In a word, the culturally essential character-shaping work of the home. I think that Wollstonecraft can especially help us to understand the common good today because the case she made for women's rights in 1792 was based not upon liberal conceptions of pre-political autonomous man, and I do mean man, as today's claims for rights tend to be. Rather, her case was grounded in the common human nature women and men share, a nature she understood to be ordered to wisdom and virtue, human excellences that took their bearing in her thought from the singular wisdom and goodness of God. So while it is very much true to say that Wollstonecraft sought to make use of the revolution in political thinking that had taken root in America and then in France in the late 18th century to include women in political efforts to secure the rights of men, even a cursory reading of her Rights of Woman reveals that the treatise was not chiefly concerned with rights at all. Rather, Wollstonecraft was concerned most especially with the advance of moral and intellectual virtue in both persons and societies, an advance that would be best realized were our politics and laws shaped around the common human dignity of each person. One might say that she shared the ancient view of human excellence as imitative of God, but sought to universalize that human quest beyond the landed classes by recognizing the basic dignity of all persons, rational creatures who were radically equal in their dependence upon and responsibility to God. The political freedom she sought through Republican government then was at the service of the moral development of each person, which consisted in large measure of virtuously fulfilling the ordinary duties of life. Law for Wollstonecraft then ought not be employed to promote natural or inherited inequalities nor maintain the strong and rich in their positions, as she believed aristocratic societies of her time unjustly did. Rather, the purpose of both law and government was to encourage progress in virtue for each and every person, rich or poor, man or woman. For human beings, attainment of virtue, not their attainment of property, wealth, or status, would guarantee personal, familial, and societal happiness. As she wrote most famously, society can only be happy and free in proportion as it is virtuous. And so, though she agreed with Hobbes that men were often quite brutish, with Rousseau that society grew out of man's perfectibility, and with Locke that a main purpose of government was to protect each person's God-given rights, she did not believe any of this required a mythical state of nature to discern. Importantly, neither did she believe these natural states, conceived so dissimilarly by Hobbes and Rousseau, for instance, explained human nature accurately. Rather, human beings are rational creatures created by and dependent upon God who require moral education and practice and self-mastery to perfect their given dispositions in order to achieve their end. Imitation of God through contemplation of the truth and benevolence toward others. Wollstonecraft's philosophical case was robust, grounded in what she took to be the unalterable truth about God and the wondrous capacities of his human creation. Human beings are endowed with the ennobling capacity to reason, quote, to rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose, end quote. The capacity to employ reason to govern our appetites and so direct us to living according to what is most excellent in us is, of course, what makes us distinct from the animals. Quote, in what respect are we superior to the brute creation if intellect is not allowed to be the guide of passion? Brutes hope and fear, love and hate, but without a capacity to improve, a power of turning these passions to good or evil, they neither acquire virtue nor wisdom. Why? Because the Creator has not given them reason. Thus, the ultimate purpose of every human life is to use one's own reason to submit to the, quote, unerring reason of God, to conform oneself to the nature of things as God has benevolently designed them, and thus to unfold one's human faculties in order to better oneself and be of service to others. Goodness has but one eternal standard, God, and thus all his creatures, regardless of sex or social status, are responsible to that single standard. Quote, the only solid foundation for morality appears to be the character of the Supreme Being. For to love God as the fountain of wisdom, goodness, and power appears to be the only worship useful to a being who wishes to acquire either virtue or knowledge. Wollstonecraft believed that the inculcation of good intellectual and moral habits at a young age would allow the person to become free, with earned independence of mind and the capacity to virtuously fulfill his or her duties. Individual agency would be achieved then through growth in wisdom and virtue, one by way of sustained intellectual and moral formation, and dynamically circumscribed by one's familial and social obligations. Such a course would allow one to choose day by day, and with increasing freedom and independence, against self-regard and mediocrity, for a life uniquely one's own, dedicated to human excellence, whatever one's personal circumstances. She writes most paradoxically to our modern ears, the being who discharges the duties of its station is independent. But such personal freedom and independence does not spring forth organically from the child. One must be taught. Desires must be schooled. The familial environment and society in which one lives must encourage each person's intellectual and moral development. And so she especially praised the work of parents and teachers, those who, quote, prepare young people to encounter the evils of life with dignity, to acquire wisdom and virtue by the exercise of their own faculties, end quote. Indeed, her advice in this regard to parents was plentiful, quote, if you wish to make your son rich, pursue one course. If you are only anxious to make him virtuous, you must take another. But do not imagine that you can bound from one road to the other without losing your way. From the person's given nature as a rational, moral, and social being sprang forth certain discernible duties to self, family, society, and God. Civil and political rights were derived, therefore, not from theoretical ruminations about a mythical state of nature, but from actual moral duties to others. For Wollstonecraft, you could say we are not first and foremost autonomous beings with rights, as Hobbes would have it, but rather beings in concrete and particular relation to one another, and with concrete and particular duties to one another. A good and just government enables and encourages the fulfillment of each person's concrete duties, in part through the protection of her rights. A person must be free to pursue the right course of action. And rights for Wollstonecraft were not absolute. Thinking of a parent's duties to their children especially, she says those who, quote, do not fulfill the duty can forfeit the right. Because political and civil institutions were properly in the service of these prior human duties, any institution that obstructed their proper fulfillment ought to be reconstituted with these more authentic human ends in mind. Quote, I mean, therefore, to infer that the society is not properly organized which does not compel men and women to discharge their respective duties, by making it the only way to acquire that countenance from their fellow creatures which every human being wishes in some way to attain. So what were these duties that characterize rational creatures, according to Wollstonecraft? First, duties to self, to develop one's rational faculties and to master one's appetites. To family, to care for one's dependent children, spouse, and elderly parents. To fellow creatures, to be useful in one's work and respect the human dignity of all others, regardless of social status. And to God, to pursue truth and goodness, and to trust in his providential designs. As I'll say more about in a moment, because Wollstonecraft viewed the affectionate inculcation of virtue in children to be among the most essential of all social duties, she regarded motherhood and fatherhood to be the very highest of all callings. The duty of the rational creature to seek the truth is the principle that underlay Wollstonecraft's tolerance of religious pluralism and her sympathy with the dissenting sects in Britain at her time. Still, she did not view religion as at all out of place in the encouragement of moral duties. Quote, the wisest laws would not be sufficient to restrain men within the bounds of morality without those powerful motives which religion affords to interest the affections and enlighten the understanding. Promotion of virtue, then, was the guiding principle by which she judged relationships, institutions, and regimes. After all, because of human interdependence, the common good of persons, families, and societies could only be achieved were the virtuous fulfillment of each person's responsibilities to others of utmost priority. Quote, a truly benevolent legislator always endeavors to make it in the interest of each individual to be virtuous. and thus private virtue becoming the cement of public happiness, an orderly whole is consolidated by the tendency of all the parts toward a common center. Wollstonecraft well understood with the pre-moderns that no person is self-sufficient. We are all parts of greater wholes. After all, persons need for their flourishing care and nurture within families, where each is responsible for the others, just as families need for their proper flourishing the goods common to the broader society. No one, but a beast or God, thought Aristotle, could go it alone. But a close corollary for Wollstonecraft was the belief that wealth, status, and power tended to corrupt those who did not work to direct their superior status, talents, and resources to the common good, and especially the weakest and most vulnerable. She did not limit her critique to the decadent rich, though, even if she believed moral corruption originated there. Wealth and property, as improperly determinative of honor, also invested the poor in a materialistic game of imitation in which they could never make true moral progress. For this reason, Wollstonecraft came to fear the new aristocracy of wealth as much, if not more, than the aristocracy of old. Quote, "If the aristocracy of birth is leveled with the ground only to make room for that of riches, I am afraid that the morals of the people will not be much improved by the change, or the government rendered less venal." The personal and societal benefits of moral development would be profound, Wollstonecraft thought. A person freed from the incessant desire to indulge one's various appetites would be more properly focused on the good of others, and thus engage in a much more meritorious undertaking, benevolence. Indeed, she believed strongly that it was each person's highest human end to imitate God's goodness through benevolence toward others. One's treatment of fellow human beings, whatever their social status, was the very best indicator of one's identification with God. From the lips of a protagonist in one of Wollstonecraft's short children's stories, quote, "If I behave improperly to servants, I really am their inferior, as I abuse trust and imitate not the being whose servant I am without a shadow of equality." But without reason directing the passions toward virtue, one's animal instincts would, quote, "run wild," rendering a person impulsive, selfish, even brutal. Not governing the passions the way one should, he or she becomes a slave to those passions, and thus not independent and free. Indeed, a freedom bereft of wisdom and virtue would reduce men to beasts. And this was especially true, thought Wollstonecraft, in intimate relations between men and women, the wellspring of the domestic affection she recognized as the source of every public virtue. After all, were God's goodness not sought as the, quote, "eternal rule of right, that by which we should judge all other claims of right, expediency and power would be all that remains to guide human action. Man's arbitrary claims of power, heeding not the higher authority of God, were the source of every oppression in Wollstonecraft's view." And it was here especially that she made an important advance for women and other vulnerable groups, articulating an ancient truth that still admonishes today. Were there no higher standard of truth or virtue, no eternal rule of right, how would one judge a law or action to be unjust? Again, without eternal right to govern human norms, persons would base their actions invariably on what is most useful, pleasing, or convenient to them, and the weak would fall prey to the strong. Quote, "For man and woman, truth, if I understand the meaning of the word, must be the same. Yet virtue becomes a relative idea, having no other foundation than utility. And of that utility men pretend arbitrarily to judge, shaping it to their own convenience." End quote. Such a relativization of truth and virtue was particularly harmful in relations between men and women, given the natural and social asymmetries between them. And so her aim was to set things between the sexes aright. For in doing that, the whole human race, divided as it was between the sexes, might have hope in progressing in virtue and thus finding happiness. Wollstonecraft thus wished to transform intimate relationships between men and women into those governed by mutual respect and affection. In her view, these relationships were too often manipulative and transactional. like a commercial enterprise, or worse, entirely destructive of human dignity. This debasement was of great consequence, and not just to the persons involved. Moral corruption of this most fundamental human relationship sowed corruption throughout the whole of society. And so it is here, in my view, that the late 18th century vindicator of the rights of women makes her most important, if yet unsung, contribution. In accord with her general view of the passions, Wollstonecraft regarded sexual desire as a natural appetite, but one that needs reason and principle to govern it. As with the other passions, the sexual appetite has certain ends knowable to the intellect, ends that can be respected or thwarted. Its ends are evident in the goods that underlie the sexual act itself. It nourishes intimate affections and encourages procreation. But pleasure, a happy ancillary of the appetites, and of the sexual appetites more so than the other, tends to trump purpose, according to Wollstonecraft. And so the sexual appetite can become, quote, depraved, rendering the person impulsive and selfish rather than focused on the good of the other, and so benevolent and free. Her most cogent moral aphorism is directed here, quote, cherish such a habitual respect for mankind as may prevent us from disgusting a fellow creature for the sake of a present indulgence, end quote. Given the asymmetries inherent in sex and reproduction, asymmetries that lent to the societal prevalence of a sexual double standard, Wollstonecraft repeatedly condemned the, quote, want of chastity in men, the grand source, she writes, of many of the, quote, physical and moral evils that torment mankind and degrade and destroy women. Rather, she thought, if men were more self-possessed, with a greater respect for the well-being of women as rational creatures made in God's image, women would not feel the need to self-objectify, degrading themselves into mere objects for men's arousal. Quote, I know of no other way of preserving the chastity of mankind than that of rendering women rather objects of love than desire. And yet, libertine men's ill respect for both women's reproductive capacity and sex's, quote, parental design placed women in especially precarious situations. Forgetting the, quote, noble use of sex, men with women indulged their desires, sometimes leaving women, quote, too weak to carry out the maternal duties that sexual intercourse potentially sets before them. They have, quote, sacrificed to lasciviousness the parental affection that ennobles instinct. And the woman now pregnant and abandoned by her sexual partner may seek, quote, either to destroy the embryo in the womb or cast it off when born. Wollstonecraft here blasts the idea that humanity had come so far from the, quote, barbarism of antiquity, at which time parents routinely exposed children who were born but unwanted. She returns to the ends of sex implanted by nature. Quote, nature in everything demands respect, and those who violate her laws seldom violate them with impunity. Surely nature never intended that women, by satisfying an appetite, should frustrate the very purpose for which it was implanted. And she ends there with an exclamation point. Wollstonecraft demanded instead that in situations such as these, the father maintain both mother and child. Such an expectation of paternal responsibility, she argues, might well bring an end to, quote, an abuse that has an equally fatal effect on population and morals, end quote. An advocate of sexual integrity and responsible fatherhood she was. Of abortion she was not. And this, we ought to remember, was at a time when pregnancy was far more hazardous to women and embryonic development far less understood than in our own time. Wollstonecraft believed that true domestic affections, man for woman and woman for man, could channel sexual energies away from the pursuit of pleasure to something that could transform society itself. Cold would be the heart of a husband, were he not rendered unnatural by early debauchery, who did not feel more delight at seeing his child suckled by its mother than the most artful wanton tricks could ever raise. Indeed, engaged and attentive fatherhood was the very best means to direct men's desires profitably by bringing them into the life of shared domesticity. And given men's power and influence in society, such an orientation would yield benefits well beyond the good of his wife and children. Listen to how she contrasts the ill effects of the libertine man with the noble citizenship of the husband and the father. Quote, "From the lax morals and depraved affections of the libertine, what results? A finical man of taste, who is only anxious to secure his own private gratifications and to maintain his rank in society. But," she continues, "the character of a husband and a father forms the citizen imperceptibly, producing a sober manliness of thought and orderly behavior." End quote. The benefits of a rich domestic life for society were manifold. Quote, "If you wish to make good citizens, you must first exercise the affections of a son and a brother. This is the only way to expand the heart, for public affections as well as public virtue must ever grow out of private character." By trading the libertine lifestyle for that first domestic affection, men and women could refine their humanity and thereby transform the world. Wollstonecraft therefore praised marriage in theory, but not as legally instituted and practiced in her time. It was the very potential she saw in the institution, were it designed with virtue and equal dignity in mind, that caused her scathing critique. Indeed, marriage was so essential to the domestic affections that Wollstonecraft regarded as the primary instruments of both personal and societal happiness, that the moral corruption of the institution of marriage was, quote, "more universally injurious to morality than all the other vices of mankind collectively considered," end quote. But a marital relationship between equals, in which each was perfected by the other through their growth in the virtue of friendship, had great potential. Wollstonecraft urged couples to love each other on account of their virtues. For, quote, "children will never be properly educated till friendship subsists between parents. Virtue flies from a house divided against itself, and a whole legion of devils takes up its residence there." Wollstonecraft's appeal for women's education and entry into the professions is her most remembered contribution today. Too often forgotten is her characterization of motherhood and fatherhood as the first duty of citizens. Quote, "It is the indispensable duty of men and women to fulfill the duties which give birth to the affections that are the surest preservations against vice," end quote. Undertaken with the intentionality and seriousness it deserves, the formative work of the family, later in collaboration with the children's teachers, could be a manifestation of human excellence itself, giving dignity, Wollstonecraft writes, to a common duty. Quote, "The parent who endeavors to form the heart and enlarge the understanding of his child has given that dignity to the discharge of a duty common to the whole animal world." If she disagreed with Burke on some important political questions, on the givenness of familial duties as the most fundamental social reality, she and Burke most heartily agreed. So what happened to this edifying and noble vision, or a vision I think is noble and edifying, by this original vindicator of the rights of women? What went wrong? Well, first, Wollstonecraft's thought was obscured early on by a preoccupation among her countrymen with the intimate but not altogether accurate details of her personal life, imprudently revealed by her bereaved husband William Godwin just after her death in childbirth. An ardent atheist, Godwin never understood Wollstonecraft's belief in God, and so, perhaps for this reason, did not like a vindication of the rights of woman as he told her when they first met. And so the natural theology, and I think the contribution of that text especially, that undergirds her rights claim is lost for a time. What's fascinating, though, is that by contrast, the early American women's rights advocates like Lucretia Mott, Sarah Grimke, and Susan B. Anthony read and understood the rights of women in its fullness, and it had a deep influence upon them. So, for instance, at our country's first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in 1848, sex equality was defended on the basis of the, quote, "identity of the race in capacities and responsibilities." And the drafters of that convention's declaration of sentiments and resolutions leaned, as Wollstonecraft did, on a classical account of natural or higher law as the source of just positive law. Additionally, as Wollstonecraft had argued, the drafters of the Declaration maintained up and against the perennial double standard that men and women ought to be held to a single moral standard, one far removed from the low standard that guides sexual ethics today. Echoing Wollstonecraft's call for sexual integrity for both sexes, then, the Declaration states, quote, that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. The movement backed up this view with a now radical belief that male sexual integrity especially would be even harder to come by were abortion or even contraception made readily available. Rather, they believed almost universally that sexual abstinence when pregnancy was not desired was the best means to both harmonize and equalize the asymmetrical sexual relationship between husband and wife, and also instill moderating habits of self-mastery and intimate regard for the other. They also believed that this practice, which they called voluntary motherhood, was the best response to the then rising crime of abortion. Like Wollstonecraft, they laid the blame for abortion mainly at the feet of lustful men. For instance, Sarah Norton, who worked successfully for admission of women to Cornell University in 1870, wrote, "Is there no remedy for all this antenatal child murder? Perhaps there will come a time when the unchastity of men will be placed on an equality with the unchastity of women, and when the rights of the unborn will not be denied or interfered with." Likewise, radical suffragist Victoria Woodhull, an ardent champion of constitutional equality for women, and the very first woman to run for President of the United States in 1872, said that, quote, "the rights of children, then as individuals, begin while yet they remain the fetus." But as the women's rights movement wore on, some began to trade Wollstonecraft's prioritization of the virtuous fulfillment of familial and social obligations, the very foundation for her argument for civil and political rights, for Locke's more individualistic and abstract conception of rights as protective of self-ownership. Likewise, in the decades following the publication of John Stuart Mill's Subjection of Women in 1869, liberty was transformed from a means to virtuously fulfill antecedent duties to an essential human capacity with the development of one's individuality foremost in mind. In Mill's telling, elites were not so much to direct their gifts toward the common good, but rather to engage creatively in experiments in living, regardless of the downstream effects on the more disadvantaged. And these views really eclipsed Wollstonecraft's influence in the women's rights movement, especially as we got into the mid to late 20th century. But many women's rights advocates resisted liberalism's pull, and in my new book, I recover their arguments in addition to Wollstonecraft's, of course. From the unsung hero of women's suffrage, Frances Willard, to industrial-era labor advocate Florence Kelley, to Harvard's own Marianne Glendon. These women saw clearly the familial and cultural preconditions required of Republican government, a just economy, and authentic liberty and equality. While Kelley argued all the way to the Supreme Court that property and contract rights during the Lochner era had been absolutized to the detriment of workers' responsibilities to their own families, Glendon's scholarship masterfully critiques the mythical, autonomous individual that remains the archetype in personal liberty jurisprudence today. Both argue, like Wollstonecraft, that the relationship between rights and duties and the common good is a fundamental one. And so, for the good of the most vulnerable especially, needs in every era to be acknowledged, strengthened, and in times like our own, restored. Given the importance Wollstonecraft, Kelley, and Glendon and others give to the natural duties in the family, it's unsurprising that these heroic women, in my view, would dissent from the anthropological assumptions of the state of nature theorists of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in favor of an older account of human nature. Rousseau's description of natural man, after all, is at quite a distance from Wollstonecraft's view of the givenness of familial obligations. In Rousseau's second discourse, we're told that natural man, quote, bedded down at random, and often for one night, according to chance encounters, opportunity, and desire, leaving children whom the father, quote, did not even recognize, to be cared for solely, we assume, by their mothers, or perhaps in an orphanage. And then when civil society comes into being for these liberal theorists, it's of course only male individuals who are counted as full liberal citizens. Women disappear into the newly erected private sphere. Men's liberal citizenship depends upon women's traditional work of nurture and care, but simultaneously renders them as dependent as their children, just the contrary of the autonomy necessary for full liberal citizenship. And so it's really no surprise that modern theories of women's rights built upon this liberal edifice would eventually place the putative right to abortion at their very center. For participation in public life and the market requires one to be unencumbered by natural obligations and beholden only to those voluntarily chosen. Unexpected pregnancy and time-consuming caregiving find no place in them. Indeed, Hobbes's view of the state of nature, characterized by radically autonomous and self-interested male and female individuals with no natural duties to speak of, but equal in their capacity to engage in a war of all against all, is not so dissimilar from the rat race of late capitalist societies. Women with infants are at an obvious disadvantage against those without such caregiving responsibilities. As in Hobbes's mythical world, they may feel the need to discard them just to survive. But of course, reality is much closer to Wollstonecraft's view. We human beings are first and foremost in relation to and dependent upon our Creator. And that most fundamental human reality connects us all through the interchange of interweaving obligations and affections, which move outward, first from our domestic affections and obligations, and only then to our more public identity. So daughter, sister, wife, mother, citizen, but also son, brother, husband, father, citizen. As Wollstonecraft well understood, relationality is not only for women. And of course, our anthropological starting point has an impact on how we think about the rights of women. Follow Hobbes, Locke, and Mill, and you get women's rights advocates seeking to make women more like mythical, autonomous men. Follow Wollstonecraft, or Glendon for that matter, and you can begin to reimagine rights born of the natural duties we owe one another. Thank you.